There are silences that speak louder than any words ever could. Not the comfortable silence of two people who have known each other long enough that the absence of conversation is itself a form of intimacy. Not the productive silence of a mind at work or the peaceful silence of a person who has finished something and is allowing themselves to simply rest in the finishing. This is a different kind of silence. The silence that grows in the space where words used to be, where a voice used to arrive, where a presence used to make itself known with such regularity that its absence, when it finally came, felt less like a missing thing and more like a wound that had slowly and without announcement become part of the landscape, incorporated into the body of a life the way an old injury is incorporated, not healed exactly, not gone, but there, always there, unremarkable until something presses on it and the pressing reveals that the unremarkableness was never the same thing as healing. 20 years is a long time for a silence. It is long enough for a child to grow into an adult who has never known the relationship as anything other than absent. Long enough for the person who maintained the silence to become almost entirely someone else. Different circumstances, different face, different relationship to the past that produced the silence and different understanding of what the silence had cost. Long enough for the person who received the silence to have made, gradually and without particular ceremony, a kind of peace with it. Not the peace of indifference. Indifference would have been easier and would have arrived sooner. The peace of someone who has accepted that certain doors remain closed and has learned, slowly and imperfectly, to build their life around the closed door rather than in front of it. And then, after 20 years, after all the accumulation of the 20 years, after the building around the door had become so habitual that the door itself had almost stopped being visible, something arrives. Not a knock. A letter. This is the story of that letter. And of the two people whose 20 years of silence it finally broke. And of what breaks and what heals and what is irretrievably lost and what turns out, against all expectation, to still be recoverable when something that has been silent for 2 decades finally finds its voice. The woman who received the letter was named Helena. She was 44 years old. She had built a life that was, by any external measure and by most internal ones, a genuinely good life. She had work she cared about. She taught literature at a secondary school, which was not a prestigious or a financially rewarding career but which was the kind of work that provided, at regular intervals, the specific and sustaining satisfaction of watching a young person encounter a book and be changed by it in ways they did not yet have language for. She had a small house with a garden that she tended with the particular affection of someone who has learned that making things grow is its own form of therapy. She had friendships, not many, but the kind that are built over years and that have, in their depth and their honesty, the specific weight of things that have been tested by circumstance and survived the testing. What she did not have, and had not had for 20 years, was her father. He had left when she was 24. Not in the dramatic, announced way that some departures happen, not with a confrontation that drew a clear line or an explanation that, however painful, at least provided the dignity of being told. He had simply become progressively less present and then absent and then gone, the way a tide goes, gradually, incrementally, each withdrawal fractionally larger than the previous one, until the day arrived when she called the number she had always called and the number was no longer in service and the address she had always written to returned her letter unopened. And she understood that the withdrawal had become a disappearance and the disappearance had become a decision that he had made. Without telling her it was being made. She had looked for him. Not obsessively and not for long. She had the self-protective instincts of a person who understands that pursuing someone who has chosen to go is a form of self-punishment that the pursued person never witnesses and that costs the pursuer everything. She had made a reasonable and honest effort to find him and had not found him and had eventually, with the specific mix of grief and anger and the kind of exhausted acceptance that arrives when grief and anger have been felt for long enough, stopped looking. She had told people, when they asked, that her father was not in her life. She had told herself, when the question arrived in the middle of ordinary nights, that she had made her peace with this. She had believed it, mostly. The mostly had been enough. The letter came on a Tuesday in October. She was between two ordinary things, the washing up from breakfast and the preparation for the school day, when she collected the post from the front door and found among the bills and the catalogues and the unremarkable administrative correspondence of an ordinary life an envelope with handwriting she did not immediately recognize and a postmark from a city 400 miles away. She did not know why she opened it before the others. Some quality in the handwriting, perhaps, something in the particular way the letters were formed that was familiar before it was identified, the way a smell can arrive and be known before the knowing becomes conscious. She opened it standing in the hallway in her coat. She read it standing there. She was still standing there, coat on, post in hand, 30 minutes later when she realized she had not moved. The letter was from her father. His name was Robert and he was 68 years old and he was, by his own account in the letter, not well, not the dramatic announcement of a terminal diagnosis, but the quieter, more honest declaration of a man in his late 60s who had lived in ways that bodies remember and who had arrived at a point in his life where the accounting of what he had done and not done had become, in the face of his own diminishment, impossible to continue avoiding. He had been living, he said, with the weight of the silence for 20 years. Not comfortably, he wanted her to know that, was insistent on it in a way that suggested the comfort or lack of it mattered to him, as if her knowing that he had not been comfortable was itself a form of apology before the apology arrived. Not comfortably and not without understanding, as time had accumulated, the full dimensions of what the silence had cost her and what it had cost him and what it had cost the relationship that 20 years ago he had decided, through a combination of shame and fear and the particular cowardice that sometimes masquerades as self-awareness, to place beyond the reach of repair. The shame was what the letter was mostly about. Not the leaving itself, though he addressed the leaving, directly and without evasion, in terms that gave her the explanation she had been owed for 20 years and had stopped expecting to receive. Mostly it was about the shame that had followed the leaving. The way the shame had compounded the silence. The mechanism by which each year of not writing had added to the impossibility of writing, the way each day of a debt unpaid makes the paying of it feel more impossible rather than less, until the debt has accumulated to a size that the debtor cannot face and so continues not paying, not because they have decided the debt does not exist but because the facing of it has become more than they believe themselves capable of. He said, "I know that 20 years is not something a letter fixes. I am not writing to fix it. I am writing because I am 68 years old and I am not well and I have spent 2 decades carrying the knowledge of what I did and what it cost you, and I cannot carry it to the end without at least having said it. Without at least having given you the words I owed you from the beginning." He said, "I left because I was ashamed of things I had done and could not face you knowing them. I know now, I think I knew then, though I could not admit it, that the leaving was worse than whatever you would have done with the knowing. That I chose my own comfort over your right to your own father. That this was a failure of love so significant that I have not found, in 20 years of trying, a way to think about it that lets me off any part of the hook. I am not writing to be let off the hook. I am writing because you deserve to know the true reason. You deserved to know it 20 years ago." He said, "If you do not reply I will understand completely and I will not write again. You owe me nothing, not a reply, not forgiveness, not the consideration of my feelings about the weight I have been carrying, because the weight is mine and I made it and carrying it is the appropriate consequence of what I chose to do. But if there is any part of you that wants to know more, or that wants to say something to me, I am here. I am at this address. I will stay at this address." Helena read the letter 3 times standing in the hallway. She read it the way you read something that is doing 2 things at once, informing and disturbing, providing and taking, the information arriving at the same time as the disruption the information causes. She put it on the kitchen table. She made tea she did not drink. She sat with the letter on the table between her and everything else and she tried to understand what she was feeling, which was more difficult than it should have been because what she was feeling was not one thing. It was many things simultaneously, led in a way that defied the neat emotional vocabulary that ordinary life provides. There was anger. Old anger, the anger she had thought she had finished with, arriving back with a freshness that surprised her. The specific anger of a person who has been waiting for an explanation for 20 years and has received it and found that receiving it does not dissolve the anger as completely as they had imagined it would. The explanation was real and it was honest and it was the one she had deserved and it did not make the 20 years not happen. There was grief. Also old, also fresh. Grief for the 20 years and what they had contained, the things he had not been present for, the things she had not been able to share with him, the particular losses within the larger loss, the moments when having a father would have meant something specific and he was not there for the specifics. Her graduation. The end of her first serious relationship, which had been hard in ways that a father might have helped with. The beginning of the work she now loved, which she had found her way to without him. The garden, which had no witness who had known her long enough to see what it had grown from. There was something else. Something underneath the anger and the grief that she was less ready to name because naming it felt like a concession she had not decided to make. It was, she turned the word over and tested it against the feeling and found it was approximately right, relief. The relief of a mystery solved. Of the explanation that had been owed for 20 years finally arriving, late and insufficient and real. She had always known it was shame, had arrived at this conclusion through years of thinking about it and had been right, and knowing she had been right did not particularly gratify her, but knowing that it was shame rather than indifference, that he had been carrying something rather than nothing, that the silence had been the consequence of a feeling rather than the absence of one, this mattered. She had not known until the letter arrived how much it had mattered to her, how much she had needed to know. It was not that she had been worth nothing to him. The letter said she had been worth something. The shame said she had been worth something. The carrying of it for 20 years said she had been worth something. This did not fix anything. It fixed something. She did not reply immediately. She lived with the letter for 2 weeks, not ignoring it, not avoiding it, but giving it the time and the space that a thing of this significance deserved before she responded to it in a way that she would be able to stand behind. She talked to one friend, not about what to do, because she had already decided what she wanted to do, but about how she was feeling, which was the more urgent and the more difficult thing to process. The friend listened with the quality of attention that genuine long friendship provides and said very little, which was exactly what was required. What Helena had decided, in the 2 weeks of living with the letter, was this: she was not going to pretend that 20 years had not happened. She was not going to perform a forgiveness she had not yet genuinely reached in order to provide her father with a comfort he had explicitly said he was not asking for. She was not going to be cruel. Cruelty had never been in her nature, and the letter, for all the anger it had revived, had not put it there. But she was going to reply honestly, which meant the reply would contain some of what the letter had produced in her, the anger and the grief alongside whatever else was there, because he had said he was writing to give her the truth she was owed, and the least she could do in return was give him the truth of what receiving it had done. She wrote for 3 days. She threw away the first draft, which was too angry, and the second, which was too carefully controlled and therefore dishonest in a different direction. The third draft was neither of those things. It was honest in the way that is hardest to achieve, not the honesty of venting and not the honesty of the composed, curated self that writes for an audience, but the honesty of a person sitting with another person's truth and finding her own truth in response to it and writing that truth down without too much management of its edges. She said, "I have read your letter many times. I want you to know that it reached me. Not in the way I might have imagined receiving it, if I had imagined it, because I stopped imagining it a long time ago. In a different way. In the way that something reaching you when you have stopped expecting it reaches you, without the softening of anticipation, directly." She said, "The anger is real. I want to be honest about that because you asked for honesty and because I think you can receive it and because pretending it is not there would be another form of the dishonesty that produced the 20 years. I am angry that you left, and I am angry that the leaving was for the reason you gave, which is a reason that required you to choose your comfort over my right to my own father, and I am angry that I have spent 20 years without the explanation I needed and am receiving it now when 20 years have passed and cannot be recovered." She said, "The anger is not everything that is there. I want to be honest about that too. I had spent a great deal of effort arriving at the conclusion that the silence was indifference and discovering that it was not indifference, that you have been carrying something, that there was a reason that was about you rather than about my worth to you, does something that I did not expect it to do. It does not excuse anything. It changes something. I cannot tell you yet what it changes because I have had 2 weeks with your letter and 2 weeks is not enough to know." She said, "I am willing to correspond. I am not willing to pretend to be further along than I am. If you can receive the truth of where I am rather than the place you might wish I were, then I will write to you honestly from here. That is what I have to offer. I don't know yet whether it will be enough or whether the correspondence will lead somewhere or whether it will simply be the exchange of 2 people who are trying to understand something that may not be fully understandable. But I am willing to try. Because I am 44 years old and I do not have the same relationship to the years ahead of me that I had at 24, and I understand, in ways that I did not then, that willing is sometimes the most honest and the most available thing a person can offer." He replied within a week. His reply was short, shorter than his first letter, shorter than hers, and it said, "Thank you." It said that willing was more than he had any right to ask for. It said that he would receive the truth of where she was, however far that was from where he might have wished her to be, with gratitude rather than with the expectation of more. It said he was glad she existed. It said this plainly and without ornament: "I am glad you exist," in a way that landed with the force of something that is said without preparation and therefore with the particular authority of things that are simply, unreservedly true. They wrote to each other over the following months. Not frequently and not always easily. There were letters that reopened things that the previous letter had left partially settled, letters where the anger arrived without warning in the middle of what had started as a different kind of correspondence, letters where she found herself saying things she had not known she was going to say until she said them and found that the saying of them was what had needed to happen. He received all of it. Not passively, he pushed back occasionally, with the honesty of a person who was not going to agree with everything she said simply because he felt he owed her agreement. He pushed back carefully and without defensiveness and in a way that, paradoxically, made the correspondence feel more real rather than less, because a father who simply absorbed everything without response would have been a performance of penitence rather than a genuine attempt at knowing each other. They met, eventually. Not immediately and not at his suggestion. He had said he would not suggest it, that any movement toward a meeting would have to come from her, that he would not use her willingness to correspond as a foothold for requesting more than she was ready to give. She suggested it after 8 months of letters, in a way that surprised herself, a sentence at the end of a letter about something else entirely, almost casual, almost as if she were testing the words before committing to them, almost. She said, "I think I would like to meet you. I think I am ready for that. I am not sure what it will be like and I am not asking for it to be anything in particular. I would just like to see you."